really wanted to retain the same identity as those original James plays, which essentially had quite a strong IP. We developed this, like, you know, kind of slightly amphitheatre-like shape to the set, and looking down like a bear pit or a stadium into a kind of playing space below, which served as, you know, castles, and in Stirling Castle, and it served as like performance spaces, and it serves as great halls, and all sorts of things, battle arenas. And the play that Rona had developed clearly asked for kind of like a stadium space, like a tournament space. In the first drafts, which are no longer in the new kind of final iteration, it also asked for like a ship at the beginning. So these people arriving on a ship into Scotland, they've been kidnapped from Spain, and they're kind of being dragged across. They were meant to be going to England, and they've kind of been pulled into Scotland by James IV. And they arrive, and that initial scene was them getting off a ship. So there was all of this kind of flavour that I was taking in as where the design might go. I was also, from the outset, really interested in trying to create a kind of a sustainable set, a set that had a very kind of low carbon footprint, or as low as we could make it. It also, ideas of like just the practical things that I were given, like touring it, in terms of the space that we could tour it, the money we had, which was a lot less than James 1, 2 and 3. So all these kind of factors were immediately in my head in the way I was kind of trying to form it. And what it therefore created was this interesting kind of conversation about how important it was to retain that initial sense of the James 1, 2 and 3 sets. So it's there in the audience's imagination, and they can see that evolution, just as the court was evolving. Like, you know, Holyrood was just being built, and so essentially it's this new evolution of a court that James IV is presenting in terms of what he wants to show the world. And so that was where those ideas came from. And wood was very important to me, you know, the ideas of shipbuilding, but also tournament spaces. This idea of creating like stadiums, but like you would with the Highland Games, effectively something that goes up and comes down, like a modern gig, but with wooden scaffolding that you're putting up and down for just, you know, 2 nights of like grand spectacle, and then they're taking it all down again. So it would be a kind of essentially a temporary space, and it would have been built like scaffolding out of wood. Laurie's very visual. He's a really great director to work with in that respect, because he really gets it. And I think again, early doors, we kind of we did really decide to make a decision to use the kind of a semblance of that original James 1, 2 and 3 plan. Now it's smaller, it's slightly different geometry, it doesn't have a lot of the stuff that it had there before, but it's got this echo, it's like a ghost image of the original plays. It was like trying to simplify that and trying to distill that in a way that because he knew how to use that set, because he'd done 3 shows on it. So immediately he could see the advantages of like adding a staircase in the centre, or reducing the space but still having that upper walkway level that we've got in the set itself now, that was there originally, but there were things that we knew how they worked, and there were kind of sweet spots to it. So we knew what they were, and we've kind of retained those things. And even in the initial drafts, Rona was talking about the tapestries of the James IV's court. So James was quite famous for bringing Flemish and commissioning Flemish tapestries and using them essentially as kind of like luxury wallpaper in rooms to show off when people visited, and they would literally be moved around, almost like moving around for a camera, so that you only ever saw the same thing readjusted. But essentially, he commissioned these tapestries. So when people came from, like the kings of Denmark came, he got these sets of tapestries, and they would be essentially put into rooms, and to make the rooms look quite magnificent, because otherwise they'd just be bare walls. The thing Laurie and I evolved was particularly this idea of the looms and the tapestries, and how they worked through the show. And because he was so strongly, working with Rona on the dramaturgy, of the play, they were evolving what the language of what that show meant and how to tell that. And some of that tapestry stuff's gone in the play. Some of the original kind of conversation and words about tapestry that were in the original plays has disappeared, but the flavour of it, I think, is still there. And so we evolved that idea quite a lot. So the set is made of a load of looms, like leaning looms. Looms like being the stretchers that you make a tapestry on, and with the threads, the kind of warp that you have kind of vertically down, the threads that you have vertically down that you then weave a weft through effectively in and out horizontally, and then you pull it tight to create that kind of image. And it was kind of quite important to us that we were evolving a history of James IV, because they're inventing themselves. It's like the modern day Instagram kind of presentation. They were inventing themselves to the world. He was basically putting on a show and going, I'm as important as any other king in Europe. You might not know who I am, and it might be in early days to my history. This is my history. And he was basically creating kind of image for himself, like invincible, strong, good, kind of artistic, cultural, kind of well-rounded, well-knowledgeable. And I think this is quite interesting in terms of what he was showing to a kind of modern. He was like the first kind of modern king in that respect. He's thinking about it in a completely different way, and he's creating this sense of like modernity and like freshness to the way that he sees things. And it's rivalry. It's rivalry with the King of England, who he hates, and he's married the future king's sister, Margaret. And already there's this sense of like rivalry going on there. And so he's trying to make himself look better. And so it's all knitted into the story, and it was kind of knitted into the set, this initial kind of bare canvas that he's basically kind of knitting in and kind of embroidering over to make himself look impressive. So we had to go through this slightly complicated process where we were just trying to work out what was a good thing to be using and what was not a good thing to be using. So the set itself doesn't actually use anything from the original show. It was all my intention to basically try and use everything, and we've ended up using nothing. After a bit of calculation, more sustainable to not be doing that, which is hard. And it's one of the most complicated things about what we're doing at the moment, is we're wrestling with this recycling or reusing new or kind of semi-virgin materials in a way that we can be, and yet we're thinking about the kind of longevity of what that is and how green it is after 5 weeks of touring, etc. So it's a really complicated process. And Chris Hay and I, the production manager, we'd done quite a lot of work on that. So I was involved in creating the Green Book originally as a design consultant, and then Chris and I, in the kind of early days of creating that Green Book, designed and created a touring theatre together for ETT. And a lot of those questions, we pondered a lot of those problems then. It's like petrol, lorries, where the cab of that lorry is joining that trailer, how it's doing it, how you've got to think about all these patterns. It's not just creating the set in the first place. So it really was the intention, but what came out of that was an interrogation of the things we were using. So underneath the set is a load of componentry, modular componentry that does belong to NTS, essentially, that we've pulled out off shelves, so like steel deck. And essentially we've clad steel deck. So although there's quite a lot of stuff there, there's not a lot of new stuff there. It doesn't belong to the old show, but it does belong to a store of stuff that can be reused and reused and reused. So it already exists. Now, that's great for budget because it saves you a lot of cash, but it also means that we've created something that does, when you strip it all of its, what I call the skin, there's actually a lot of components that will go back on a shelf and will have a much, a further life, had a previous life, but will now have a further life. So that was quite important. And then the other thing is a lot of that stuff is reusable. So all that wood that I've got on that set essentially hasn't really been touched. It's not got layers of texture on it or other things on it that mean that another carpenter or another designer can't literally turn it around, and they've got a nice plain, clean surface with not very many screw holes in it, that they can reuse it. So it was a massive factor, huge. But the way we kind of have progressed it through that initial kind of, I want to reuse the entire set from the James 1, 2 and 3, it's interesting how that's evolved. I think the play is very much about tournaments. There's these tournaments that run all the way through it. And I think what was important is creating a space that could land pieces of architecture, like rooms in a castle, like Holyrood, as well as like a space where fights could happen. So what I'm trying to create is a sense of like a stadium, like a temporary stadium, as well as creating a space that can create a chamber place where two people can have a scene. Because there's 11 people in the cast, and we go from big scenes to small scenes, and sometimes there is only two people on the stage, so they can't feel dwarfed. They've got to feel like a sense of like enclosure, and that maybe somebody's listening in, or maybe someone can enter at some moment, or maybe they feel trapped. There's a chamber quality to the piece that at times that I think was really important. And I didn't want to remove the audience too far from them. So it couldn't be too big. It couldn't be too far away from them, because you want to draw them in and feel the delicacy of like a bedroom scene and the kind of voyeuristic sense of like being there for this kind of slightly awkward moment between King James and his wife, his very young wife. So that was kind of very important to me. The other thing I think is in terms of the space is it's moving from, this is a tour, and it's moving from theatre to theatre. So it starts in Edinburgh. It started in Edinburgh Festival Theatre, moved to the King's in Glasgow, the Theatre Royal in Glasgow, and then it moved to Dundee, and it's kind of shape-shifting all the time. It's getting smaller, bigger, mostly smaller, and the audiences are getting kind of closer and closer. Like in Dundee, they're very close. There's an intimacy to that theatre which I love. And it's got a kind of amphitheatre kind of wraparound quality to it. So essentially, this is an inverted shape to that space. So when it was in Dundee, I wasn't there, but the head of stage, head carpenter, sent me some photos, and it looks beautiful. It looks exactly as I'd intended. No masking, like really, really beautifully. I think it was really beautifully kind of connected to the audience, so that it feels like they're at one in this amphitheatre. They're completing the amphitheatre, rather than it's a set and they're an audience. There's a kind of connection to that, and I'm really interested in that kind of immersiveness to the way that the scenery is. Theatre's an amazing thing. We're literally four-dimensional. We're in that space. It does things that television and cinema can't do, because you can breathe. You're breathing with them, and you can feel the heat. And it's really important to kind of break that frame that sometimes proscenium marches give you, but cinema and TV obviously give you, and try and pull it into that space. And so the set is also trying to do that. It's got that sense of breaking through a kind of a surrounding structure, and the set's pushing in. And there's a few little tricks in there. There's like a little bit of false perspective in the floor. There's lots of things that are trying to basically push it into the audience. So the set is made of a kind of outer walkway, which is raised up by essentially just over 2 meters. So you can basically create two doorways underneath it. And the centre of it is the stairs that takes you from floor level up to that upper walkway. And against that walkway are leaning 6 looms. So medieval looms made of warp and weft, like there's essentially horizontal strings, vertical strings that you then run a kind of wool through effectively to create the tapestries that you would see nowadays in kind of Stirling Castle and Holyrood. And those were kind of big winding structures that have got wheels on them that effectively you can create tension, and they provide our kind of walls effectively, which means we can light through them. So they've got a sense of kind of transparency. Or like a gauze, when you light a gauze, when you light them from the front, they create more of a solidity and opacity. You can really feel that there is a piece of structure there. The walkway is made of scaffolding, which underneath it is some steel decks, some essentially some steel legs and some steel rostra. And then it's kind of cleverly clad by the builders, Pretty Scenic. They've essentially collared each one of those steel scaff poles, 48mm diameter scaff poles, and they've kind of, over the top of that is slotted a piece of wood on each one of those, and kind of very carefully constructed so it looks like everything's made out of wood. The original intention was to make everything out of wood, but when you've got actors and people on stage, you know, moving that, and it's got to go up and down in a day, it's a very hard thing to make those things sit structurally stable. So that's why it ended up being a steel structure underneath. The floor is made of a simple wood sheeting, like essentially untreated wood timber, and it's made of a timber called Weezer, particular timber called Weezer, which means it's got a kind of moiré grain in it. It's got like a kind of watery grain in it. So it's not a flat thing like birch ply, which is very hard, but is also very even, very kind of cool looking and very kind of like coffee bars. Modern day coffee bars are made of it, but essentially it doesn't have that kind of grain in it that I was interested in. Weezer is also more sustainable than birch, because it's quicker growing as a piece of wood. So it made sense to use that. And then around the outside of that are a series of poles that provide essentially pickup points for some pulleys that sit at the top of it, that mean we can hoist flags, effectively banners, up and down to create a sense of tournament. And we can create the kind of royal coat of arms appearing 6 times around it. And in the rear of all of that, it's slotted between an upper walkway, kind of the stairs up to the upper walkway, and the stairs that go down, is essentially a big drawbridge that sits underneath the set and then is pulled up from the flies up with a portcullis dropping down at the same time to almost create a kind of shutter effect. That means we can create a portcullis and a set of doors quite easily without flying them in and out. So I was quite interested in, well, I am interested in the way that we use things kinetically in scenery, so that it's not just a series of things that are flown in and out in a kind of old Victorian way, but things can surprise you from coming from different places and reimagine and kind of imaginate the space.